Caroline and Derek, I want to let them tell the story of this piece of work, but it's, you know, it's really, I mean, collaborating in art and two different mediums in collage and prose is so exciting because it's like bringing together these two really brilliant and creative people and then seeing what comes of that. And I know they're going to talk more about that. Our plan for the evening is Caroline will be showing her artwork, and Derek will read some of the selections of prose that they've chosen to share from the work. It's quite a big collection, so he's only going to read a few, but at the end of the night, you'll be able to snap up a copy. We have a code, really easy to scan to buy it with a special price for this event. I think it's $40 flat, no shipping extra. So that's a great deal and a great way to support these independent artists and an independent press working hard to bring this book to the world. Please feel free to put your questions for Caroline and Derek in the chat Q&A box. I'll be looking through them as they're talking. And at the end, when they're done presenting, I'll select some of those to ask to Caroline and Derek, and we'll have a little Q&A at the end. After that, then we'll open up the link to go ahead and purchase the book if you'd like to do so. And again, we'd appreciate your support. So without further ado, because we want to hear from the author and the artist themselves, welcome Caroline, welcome Derek. I know all your fans are out watching, and it's wonderful to see you both here. Finally, here we are celebrating your book. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Thank you and welcome everyone. Derek and I are so very excited to share our book, The Villagers, with you this evening. Derek will be reading a few of his stories, so you are in for a real treat. And I will be talking a bit about the art that inspired these fantastical tales. But first, let's step into my studio for a few minutes. For those unfamiliar with my artwork, I've worked in collage for almost 30 years and maintained a studio for nearly as long in Long Island City. I work on large tables, and this is an example of what my workspace looks like when I begin a series. This is really neat in comparison to what this will eventually look like. My studio is full of old books, magazines, and ephemera, most of which would have landed in the trash had I not rescued it. I have magazines in my studio that are over 100 years old. All my work is hand cut, and I create nothing on the computer. And if I cut an image and I end up not using it, it is filed away in tiny drawers by subject. And my personal favorite tiny drawer is full of eyeballs. I delight in that every time I open that little drawer. The narrative has always played a significant role in my work, but it was in preparing for a solo exhibition in Israel in 1999 when I fell down that rabbit hole and began revisiting beloved childhood tales and re-examining them as an adult. The first tale I went after was Alice's Adventures Underground, which is the original story Lewis Carroll told Alice Liddell on that summer's day a long, long ago. The show in Israel consisted of some 60 pieces of Alice-themed collages. This piece that you're looking at was not in that show, but it is an example of how Alice story still inspires me. As an aside, if you notice the tire swing on the lower left-hand corner, it's attached to the tree with a braided gold thread, and any vibration will cause that tire to swing. This piece hangs in a dentist's waiting room, and I have had the joy of watching patients' reaction when it suddenly starts to sway back and forth. This piece is called From Above, and it is 31 by 27 inches. After the show in Israel, I began to visit fairy tales in earnest. I just decided to own it. I never found the main characters in these stories particularly intriguing. Instead, it was the enchanted landscapes where these tales took place that piqued my imagination. I vividly remember how the words "once upon a time" would cause a portal to open. The light would shift ever so slightly. The sounds around me would grow muffled, and suddenly I was in that place that was neither here nor there, and it was all mine to explore. This is a nod to The Princess and the Pea. It took me forever to find all those peas, finally resorting to painting over some of the photographs of grapes. Anyway, it's called Perchance to Dream, and it's 24 by 17 inches. I am very interested in The Day After the Happily Ever After. This nod to the Cinderella story, which by the way is one of the oldest fairy tales we have, focuses on the object of desire, the shoe. My studio was once the Scalamandre Silks building, and I was a lucky recipient of some wallpaper scraps, which you see in some of these pieces that I've used in the background. This is called Next Dance, and it's 29 by 16.5 inches. This is a close-up of the shoes from that piece. This is a good example of how I work. I mount the cut imagery on archival paper and I recut it, giving the image more dimension, and not wanting the illusion to be broken, I paint the edges to cover any traces of white paper. Adding a bit of magic to these, I tried my hand at some embroidery. Often I end up lifting the images off the supporting board, inviting the viewer to enter the work even further. I am always delighted when I exhibit my work to see nose prints on the glass. Bringing this piece brings forth the story of a Sleeping Beauty's nap during the days of our lockdown. I've often thought of my work as merely a way to capture a dream. This piece is entitled At a Snail's Pace, and it's 19 by 32 inches. Fairy tales are not about the bibbidi bobbidi boo. The characters in these stories, they live and they die. So I'm interested in exploring those human forces that swirl around these tales and what energy they leave behind in their wake. Rage, pain, and humor are chief among them. This piece, created in 2021, was a equal measure of Rapunzel and my need to want to travel again. Hence the title Wanderlust. It's 20 by 26. But getting back to the villagers. So I've said I was never interested in the main characters of these stories, the king, the queen, the prince, the princess, and so forth. But I did begin to wonder who would lurk in the shadows of these enchanted places I was recreating. Who were the supporting cast members, the unmentioned, the unrecognized? I created this series in 2009 to answer that question. Initially, I was going to write to them about them, but they sat in my flat files for years, waiting for the right time to bring them out. Every time I accidentally opened the drawer, I felt them staring up at me, wanting to scream, yes, we're still here. Are you going to do anything with us? In the spring of 2020, when there was no social interaction to speak of, I started posting these pieces on Instagram, where Derek Owens happened upon them. So Derek, I think it's time to share our story about this book.
Okay, thanks. And what I'll do is I'll just dive right into one of the stories and then talk for a couple minutes after that, and then jump into another one. And this is The Welder. And I always like, when I hear somebody reading, I always like to have a sense of how long I'm in for. So I think this one clocks in at about 3 minutes. This is the shortest of them. The Welder. When the demons rose from the sewers to eat our shadows, we didn't notice at first. After all, demons have been coming and going for as long as we can remember, commingling and bartering, and even more frequently in the last 2 generations, marrying into our families. It's gotten so that we have trouble at times differentiating the smaller demons from our own children, for so many share the same gelatinous beaks, the singing ear holes, the torn and soggy moth wings that they suck on all day, the artichoke skin coats, the puckered bleeding eye spots, the absurd Martha Washington hair. If you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. Then we noticed some of them, the demons, obviously, were stealing our shadows out from under us when we were taking naps or otherwise preoccupied. They'd slurp them down on the spot, then scurry away, but not before sliding prosthetic facsimiles back in place, assuming we'd be none the wiser. which are of inferior quality, of course, and turn to gummy gray curd in less than a day. After that, one's interior essences begin to bake. One or both pupils turn to wood. And of course, there's the halitosis. If you've never seen someone who has had their shadow eaten, let me tell you, it's no picnic. We called in the welders. Chief welder Little Betty, having dealt with this before in several of the neighboring valleys, lost no time. She and the other maids scattered throughout the town and tossed a handful of sanctified umbra grit down every grate and manhole. The effect has no impact on us, of course, but for demons, the allure is impossible to resist. The hordes soon gathered at the gateways and wept to be allowed to descend so that they might chase after their catnip, which the little girls allowed, but not before using their irons and torches to force the thieves to vomit out all the shadows they'd consumed, and which the welders then collected within their holding shields. Once every last goblin had returned to its lesser hell, little Betty instructed her troops to solder the gateways shut. Then they dumped the recovered shadows in one slippery, slimy pile in our central square. We draped them on drying racks. It took several days before they were cured and had the strength to crawl back to their hosts. We'll have to eventually reopen all the sewer grates to prevent flooding, and so we've drawn up a committee to receive bids from various exterminating companies who claim high success rates in keeping demon hordes safely below ground. But I, for one, am not worried. In fact, welcome their return so that we can go through this all over again. Because man, I tell you, it's just something to watch those little pixie welders, each one smaller than the demons by half, standing their ground, pointing their blazing weapons at the snarling, whimpering hell spawn, utterly in command of their powers, and all the while giggling themselves silly. So I guess one of the things that's not all that, but it's pretty obvious, is that, you know, when I was sitting there looking at these images that Carolyn had made and thinking about them, and of course, this is during the early months of the pandemic, and it was obviously, it was a very strange time. And so this idea of some kind of menacing atmospheric force, some strange thing out there, it kind of permeates more than a few of these tales. And so you get a little bit of a sense in this one. Carolyn, did you want to jump in for anything, or do you want me to keep going with the other one, or?
Well, one of the things that I know I've been asked in the past is how we really collaborated on this. And so I just wanted to make mention that Derek had asked me if I would mind if he would write stories to these pieces. And I think originally, Derek, I think maybe you saw 5 or 6 of them.
Yeah.
And so I was like, sure, knock yourself out. So I sent him 37 images, and I figured that would keep him busy for a while. So he actually wrote to my artwork. And I just want to say that when I finally had the courage to read them all, because I was a little afraid I might not like them, not for any particular reason, but just, not knowing what was going to come forth. I just was amazed at how, Derek, you gave voice to all these characters, and I just could never have imagined what they had to share. So just want to put that out there.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that too, because I mean, obviously, I think the burden was always entirely on you, because this thing could have gone south, really. I mean, because if I had just written a piece like, what the hell is this? Why would you do this to my daughter? It wouldn't have gone anywhere. So you were very tolerant, and I didn't have to worry about, like all the worst that would happen is for me to just stop writing, I guess. But yeah, and this next one, I'll read the Little Prince. This one's longer than the other one. And one thing about this too, I mean, it's no surprise either to see that and I wasn't aware of this at the time, but since all of these are portraits and these are all headshots, there's a lot running through the book about thought, minds, spheres, heads, brains, and so forth. But it was also interesting because so many of these portraits, some of them have certain minimal, features, but many of them are blanks. And so that also gave me, even more permission to just kind of, you focus on a portrait, but there's nothing there like in this one other than a white field. And so it kind of helps. It helped me anyway, dive into this space. So this is The Little Prince. Maybe I'll move it over here. This hand's a little bit better at holding books. The Little Prince. You must understand it was never his fault, not really. He was but a child, negligible, ignored, ever operating in the shadow of older brother, the heir. So silent, some thought him a feeble-minded mute, content to spend his solitary days with his collection of birds' nests. Sleeping at night with us, the royal hounds, his only companions, who curled about him as one of our pack, a hairless runt we kept warm by instinct, enfolding him within our glossy pelts. For long stretches of time, even Queen Mother and her aunties would put him out of their minds, recalling his existence only when a servant brought to their attention some new affliction or injury, for he was a sickly child prone to accidents. But as soon as younger brother was entrusted to the court physicians, it was as if the fact of him once again ceased to be, and the absence of him, so to speak, returned. What was it like for him to hear day in and day out of older brother's glorious accomplishments? Older brother, Janos, the heir apparent, monarch in waiting. Older brother, future guide and overseer to the realm, implicit savior. The days reverberated with his name. Parlor maids and butlers composed songs about his exploits, real and fabricated, to the point where it seemed the palace itself were performing an endless, looping musical tribute. Older brother this and Janos that, older brother who, upon coming of age, would rightfully escort the city and surrounding territories into the 100 years of most marvelous imaginings. And that gilding crown he would one day wear, housed in the celestial sanctum, deep inside the center of the palace, waiting upon the altar of rectitude until the day it would be placed atop older brother's head. So you see, it was inevitable. The time would come when younger brother, so insignificant and affectless, so inappreciable, so little, would, not out of malice or jealousy, but nothing more than innocent curiosity, slip through the imperial guards, unnoticed, as if a wraith, enter the sanctuary, climb atop the chapel stage, and at long last, as if fulfilling his own private destiny, reach outward with twiggy arms to take the crown and place it upon his head. Unaware, of course, you see this now, that the crown would affix itself permanently to the child's head, irremovable and everlasting, assigning itself to that invisible boy for life, thereby rendering him no longer invisible, but veritable, undeniable, birthing him, in essence, for a second time. And the shock of it all, of the guards who, snapping out of their boredom, alerted by the piercing sparkle of the crown on the child's head, too large for him, it fit no better than a bucket, fell into a panic as he nonchalantly walked out of the sanctum. Of the hysterical attendants who, trembling and palsied, raised the alarm. Of the priests who came running from their harem chambers, weeping in rage. Of Queen Mother who, upon confronting her youngest with a purity of hatred, reached out to pluck the crown from the boy's head, only to howl in agony as the metal seared her hands, the musk of burning flesh filling the grand foyer. Of older brother himself who, incensed to the point of madness at his pipsqueak brother's betrayal, leaped forth with blade to separate his sibling's head from the trophy he had snatched, only to have his own body betray him, his muscular arm lurching inelegantly backwards, cleaving at the neck, his head bouncing across the flagstone floor until coming to rest at the feet of little brother, where it gazed with seething rage at the little prince. Queen Mother would later that night instruct the aunties to take her eldest son's head and place it atop the golden pillow on the chapel stage, where the royal crown had once sat awaiting its successor, the severed head's livid eyes blinking back tears even in death. You know the rest, of course. how this crown had been fashioned long ago in prehistory by the salamander people, metalsmiths skilled in arcane arts now lost to humanity, and who had imbued it with phantom powers terrible and cruel. For the crown, made conscious now by the act of being worn, was nothing less than sentient, aware when any who might approach had ill intent and would respond in kind. Medusa-like, zapping all would-be thieves and usurpers and assassins into psychosis, causing them to inflict upon themselves gruesome penalties. Of this, the little prince was oblivious. Unaware of the many attempts upon his life, he went about his days no differently than he had before, preoccupied with his amusements, cataloging his nests by size and color, documenting the breed of bird that had fashioned them, sketching egg fantasies in his notebooks, spending hours holding the little woven dens in his hands, turning them about in the sunlight, staring into the hollows of these wooden cups for hours. What went through the mind of the little prince during these reveries? Did the ghosts of the former inhabitants manifest there in his mind's eye? And did he peer into their imaginal eggs to learn the secrets of flight? Did he himself fly elsewhere and away for hours, perhaps days at a time, as the kingdom went about its sad and dreary days as before, and over time forgot about him and the royal palace too, which fell into disrepair? We cannot be sure, of course, but each night we, his hounds, encircle him, making a nest of our bodies within which little prince might sleep undisturbed, dreaming of the eggs that once sat within his little nests, the sleeping unborns within, soaring out and away within his nocturnal fantasia, cloaked and comforted by our warm bodies. Eggs within nests, nests within eggs.
So Derek, I have a question for you. I love this piece. I love that the last visual. How did you, when I gave you all, so you saw some of the images on Instagram, and then I handed you a huge batch of them. How did you approach them?
Oh, right. Yeah. That I actually, because there wasn't a whole hell of a lot going on, if you remember, during pandemic. And so I was, aside from just doing my own work, I would take long walks during the day, like a lot of people were. I would look at one or two of the images that you had, and I had them on my phone. And I would, first of all, the night before, I would look at them before I fell asleep, just thinking that I might think about them while I was sleeping. I don't know if I did or not, but it was, that was my method. And the next day I'd be taking a walk. And I would just think, I would keep looking at that image and just think about whatever came to mind and start jotting little notes down. And then I would go back home and, over a day or two, just flesh something out, sitting in the basement where I tend to do a lot of writing. Yeah, it was that. I think one of the things that was also interesting was when you're taking walks during the pandemic. I mean, a lot of you, if not everybody, can relate to this. I mean, I'm out in the suburbs, out in Long Island. There wasn't much going on. Traffic was really quiet. This especially in the first couple months, where people didn't know what was really happening. And you were walking down the sidewalk and there wasn't anybody there. And then after a while, I would see several blocks away, somebody else coming this way. And everybody had learned really quickly what the protocol was. Oh, one of us is going to have to walk in the middle of the street, because I didn't even know if that time we knew there was the 6-foot rule that the little COVID gnats, they can only fly for 6 feet till their wings get tired and then they fall to the floor or whatever. But anyway, that was it. And so there's this sense of just, these other humans that you would rarely see, even though everybody's inside their houses doing whatever, or, panicking or sleeping or just watching TV. So there's a sense of people everywhere, but you just can't see them. And then occasionally when you would see somebody coming by, there was a sense that, they might have the plague and I need to, I don't want to be rude and say, get away, so there was that weirdness in those moments that would surface amidst the emptiness of those days. So it created an interesting kind of backdrop that, I guess, for whatever other reason, seemed to help engender these stories while looking at these images.
You know, when they were in my flat file for so many years, and I really was waiting for the right time for them to appear, never imagining that this would be the time that that they would find their place and speak out. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it is interesting that you've got all these, this village of people, in hibernating and waiting in the dark. And then when everybody else has to go into hibernation, that's when they like, all right, let's go, let's pop out, let's infiltrate the neighborhood.
And what's the next story that you're going to read? I'm so excited, by the way. These are a lot of stories that I have not yet heard Derek read before.
There's two more that we've got, and this one is about the same length as the previous one, and the one after this will be shorter. And then and those are the only ones I've got for now. This one is called The Fairy Dust. Let me make sure I got the right page here. Yep. Though we christened her Portia, one of the least popular choices from the list of approved firstborn girl child names is mandated by our settlement. In private, we called her Fairy Dust, as ultimately that is what delivered her into our orbit. My wife and I, for years unable to conceive, had heard of a fishwife living in the port of M, a recluse said to possess keen powers of conjuration and delivery. After a long and uncomfortable journey through the vinegar districts, we found our way to her home. The woman proved to be as grouchy as we feared, but confirmed that, yes, she could indeed bring forth a child, a girl, though not without warning us of the usual side effects beyond her control. It's no concern, we replied, waving her cautions away. We had, of course, heard them all before. If our daughter were to be born with spangled gills or a thistle tail or even one of those vestigial goat moon eyes, it would matter not to us. We would love her everlastingly. Her fee exhausted nearly all of our savings, but paid it we did, though not without casting sideways looks at one another as we surveyed the tumble-down cabin, her threadbare mourning costume, the cluster of moldy beets on the kitchen floor. Assuming she extracted this same sum from other fruitless couples seeking her charms, what on earth could she be doing with the profits? But one must be delicate with witches. We dared not ask. I shall not bore you with the specifics of the elaborate operations we were to follow, most of which you are no doubt familiar with. Broths of rabbit placenta, prurient calisthenics performed on beds of moss, bee entrapment. We were curious, however, about the contents of the small matchbox she gave us after pocketing our wad of bills, along with a tied scroll containing what she called the extra recipe, as if we were going to bake a cake. No reading till home, she mumbled. We inquired as to the contents of the box. Dead fairy wings, dried, powdered, she said. That night, the jitney ride took even longer, or so it seemed, probably because our emotions were an antsy cocktail of anticipation, doubt, and worry. We gazed out the window at the walled city of algorithms in the distance, the czar's pinnacles, a luminous, milky sparkle against the midnight horizon. As the coach pitched and bobbled along the rutted path, the blush of bonfires from roadside shanty towns casting ginger shadows about her face, my wife spoke only once the entire time. Fairy dust, she said, shaking her head. Too bleary-eyed upon reaching the house, we waited until morning to try and decipher the witch's note. No small feat, as her instructions were written in a shaky, smeary hand, the letters like ants crawling atop one another. Once feeling satisfied that we had made sense of her bird scratch, we followed her recipe to the letter, except that is for the final step. Here, the fishwife's prose was so illegible, her words presented us with quite a conundrum. It seemed to me she'd written, dissolve wing powder in glass of horse syrup, avoid coffin breath for fortnight. My wife disagreed, reading instead, bury wing powder in garden of hyssop, around cauldron, couple for fortnight. Neither made much sense to us, but then neither had many of the previous directions. Pouring our clip toe and fingernails into paper boats made from folded family photos, for example, then tucking them into the fork of an echo tree. But seeing as my interpretation was unachievable, horse syrup, whereas my wife's take could at least be accomplished, we settled on the latter. We had hyssop coming up in the herb garden already. We substituted our biggest cooking pot for a cauldron. The coupling part came easily enough for the first week, though grew more perfunctory in the second. It's surprising how a fortnight can drag on so. And so we attempted, with mixed results, to imaginatively revamp our routine. After all the boxes were checked off, the powdered wings buried, the conjugal observances concluded, all that was left was to wait. It was difficult. What if we'd misread her directions? And worse, what if we were successful, but through even a small misapplication, maybe our paper boats were unseaworthy, the hyssop garden not established enough, our Congress at times uninspired, caused the child to be born with some terrible affliction. But as my wife's belly began to round in the ensuing months, any reservations we had gave way to busied excitements as we prepared for baby's arrival. And on the day she was born, we saw that she was perfect. Right down to her metallic cheeks, the flounder eyes, and ring of golden fingers encircling spider-like her blameless, shimmering face. And as it turned out, little fairy dust, as she approached her 5th birthday, revealed a most singular talent, one that we doubt had anything to do with the fishwife's magic and more with some unrealized kink in the way we had administered the recipe, our own signature added to the mix. One rainy day, as we three sat at the kitchen table reading our books, fairy dust looked up, ears cocked, listening. Do you hear her? She asked. Hear whom, dear? Her, the one that speaks to me. She's finally come. She's right there on the other side of the membrane, on the other side of the membrane. And with that, all her little golden face fingers started to quiver in unison, creating the loveliest hum. And fairy dust took her hand and, extending her index finger before her, made small twirling motions as if stirring cream in an imagined cup of coffee. A hole formed in the air no bigger than a silver dollar. And through this aperture, from the other side, a second little finger poked through. As our daughter and the unseen other touched fingertip to fingertip, we heard a giggling come from the everwen, accompanied with the thrumming of wings. Fairy dust looked at the two of us. My sister, she said, smiling.
That gives me such chills. I can't even tell you. You know, it's funny when I talked about eyes before, the eyes in this piece I had before anything else. And I think they're images like gems or jewels from an old manuscript, a cover of an old manuscript. And I had them in a little dish on my desk for a long, long time. And I knew I wanted to do something with them. So it was from those eyes that this piece grew out. And I love the fact that you referred to them as flounder eyes, because that's perfect term for them. Now that people have been seeing some of these images up on their screen, I wanted to point out something that happens as a collage artist is sometimes I find something that I'm drawn to that will inspire an entire series. And that happened here with the series of villagers. If you notice, these portraits are on vintage or antique book covers. There's a shop in the city here called Argosy, and they had a bin of these old book covers that it once had housed, bound together books that were past their resale. And so they just sold the covers. And I was just so intrigued by these covers. Every time I went into the shop, I bought more of them. And I began to wonder what these covers had held, who held those books, because these leather covers are so time worn. And so these covers had a whole narrative onto their own, and they became the perfect little stages for these portraits to be placed upon. So everyone is on a different book cover, and some of the covers, I think I saw one, the oldest one is dated like 1825. So they are the connector to all of these.
You also did, I mean, for the process of these two, you had something where you allowed yourself to only use 4 or 5 pieces of material or something for each image is another kind of like enabling constraint, sort of.
Yeah, well, actually, the series, I had done a rather complicated series before I started this one, and you could see from the previous work that I showed that some of my collages can be quite complex. And to get off that hamster wheel that I find myself on, because I can be a little obsessive collecting imagery and putting it together, I gave myself an assignment that these collages could only be comprised of 5 pieces maximum, including the book cover. So yeah, I stuck to that pretty strictly, and it was a great exercise, and especially when I work in a series. So I was working on all 37 of these at the same time. So to limit the amount of components was great help. Kind of cleared my head.
What were, by the way, what are the bronze looking antennae things around her head? What were those from? Do you
So
remember?
frighteningly enough, I do remember where most of these things are cut from. I think that's a sculpture
Okay.
from an art magazine. I do to the audience out there, I'm very, very careful with the imagery that I select. I don't want to step on any other artists' toes, photographers, and certainly I don't want to be accused of copyright infringement. So I really kind of whittle down the imagery as much as possible so that it becomes unrecognizable. But I do think that was from a bronze sculpture, contemporary.
Right.
And then the plate, the face is I think it's from a Bronze Age, like I think it's a shield from the Bronze Age.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. You want me to read the last one?
Sure.
All right. This one is the gardener.
Oh, Alan.
Well, that's the itinerant. I can read. Okay. The gardener.
Oh, which one do you want to read? It's
No,
your choice.
we'll read the gardener.
Okay.
Put that itinerant away. That was.
You know what? He's like that. He pops up when you
Okay.
least expect it.
Yeah. And just disappears. Yeah. This is the gardener, and this is a shorter piece. Sisters of cells and soil, thank you so very, very much for your more than generous welcome and the absolutely lovely luncheon. It is my honor and privilege to speak before you today. Ever since my colleague, Miss Gertrude Jekyll, yes, by all means, applaud her. Ever since Sister Gertrude made me aware of your organization, I have been transfixed from afar by the most incredible discoveries surfacing in the course of your ongoing research. And while it is always a rare treat to commune with you periodically via psionic journeying, there is, of course, nothing that rivals the intimacy of face-to-face communion. And so I trust you will believe me when I say it is an absolute joy for me to be here on this side of the pond, addressing the illustrious Blind Owl Springs Faculty Wives Cognitive Gardening Society. I should like to begin by taking you on a tour of the grove I have been sculpting of late. Those of you able to conjoin during our last transcontinental thought meet have already seen a handful of my projections, but none until today will have had the chance to amble through the twists and turns of the extrasensitory grounds I'll be conjuring here this afternoon. And so please, I invite you with open arms, join me as we smell the roses together. Now, if you could, please join hands. I see some of you are ahead of me already. Close your eyes, breathe relaxed, full breaths. Let the darkness wash over and through and out. Look, see, there as the black sun expands and the horizon draws near. Can you make out the white matter? The geary folds all aglow, reflecting the pulsing of the ion channels. And up ahead, on either side of the rusty iron gate that creaks so, one of these days, sisters, I shall tend to that. Parallel nests of cow cucumber and joe pie plant greet us hello. And the password, they whisper, what is the password? To which we reply, whisper with me now, comfrey and witch's thimble, yes. A cluster of hedge maids stippled with elfwort, biomarkers both, can barely express their excitement as we enter the frontal operculum. As we tiptoe along the mesolimbic circuit, don't miss the snuggling of the blooming Sally. Be sure to inhale the crisp tang of bear's grape and harefoot releasing beneath our naked toes. Allow the fairy cups to kiss you hello. Under a copse of dendrites and milfoil, glial cells are feeding. Note how the astrocytes mimic African pepper, or what you more commonly know as grains of paradise. And over here, where the rhubarb vies for our attention, are floating row covers rippling in the limbic breeze, the blood-brain barrier, beneath which moon daisy and Low John the Conqueror germinate deep within the loamy insular cortex. Hear that low-throated humming? That's a song of Kiss Me at the Garden Gate flowers, their stamens vibrating off in Wernicke's area. And see those figurines strung above a circlet of mandrake root next to where the madder fern waves? On a whim, I hung there several juju poppets stuffed with eucalyptus leaves I couldn't resist. Continue betwixt the parietal lobes. Allow the balls of your feet to register the rumblings of the basal ganglia percolating deep in the mind dirt compost. Look at how bright the eye balm blinks, peeking from the occipital cortex as cuddle chemicals rise like gnats from the bramble kite. And now I bring you to a most wonderful treat. She took me quite by surprise. Who knew an act of intracranial invocation, no matter how fiercely sustained, might manifest entities? But there she is, sitting on the lip of the medulla oblongata, swinging her feet. I love to watch how her ancient hands conduct the synaptic pruning and fold the proteins. Notice the crown of chameleon stars in her hair, how they reflect the dense night of thought. Let's not venture any farther, lest we frighten her, the hidden gardener of this chimerical realm, our moony little orchard, this resplendent shadow farm, thick with a scent of chlorophyll and copper. But it is time. We've reached the end. I'm afraid we must conclude our stroll as we float far above the synaptic clefts, the plots of ripple glass and sticklewort receding beneath our feet. Before we return fully to our earthly light, however, the garden grants us a parting gift. Pinch yourself a nosegay from the patch of bumblebee basil by the potting shed. Breathe in the imaginable perfume as you return to your chairs. And now, slowly, open your eyes. Applause.
Yeah.
And there you have it.
Well, before we turn this over to back to Ellie, who is our publisher extraordinary, Derek, I want to thank you. Now when I go to my studio and I open up those flat files and I see all those villagers looking up at me, I turn to them and say, see, it was worth the wait. So thank you so much for putting voice to my to my villagers and now our villagers. And I'd also really want to thank Ellie and all the people at Animal Heart Press for taking a chance on this project. It's a weird and wacky one, and you guys were fully behind us, and we have such a beautiful book as a result. So thank you so much. And thank you to, there's a lot of audience members out there who really helped in various ways. I don't want to overuse the it takes a village, but in fact it does. So thank you so much to everyone.
And thanks, Caroline, too, for giving me permission to write into these, because easily after the first one, you could easily have said, yeah, let's not do this. So it was, I owe you for that. And again, thank you, Ellie and Amanda, who's out there, and Beth. And yeah, I mean, the way this got published too is that Caroline, you had sent a couple of the pieces, two of the pieces to their journal, Feral.
Mm-hmm.
And And then Amanda saw it, and then you happen to mention, we got a manuscript. And it's very hard. It's extremely hard, I think, to get a publication that is more or less 50-50 text and image like this. There's more of them around, but it's still, I think it's a rarity. And so it's great to have had the chance to do this. And especially in a book that is, the way Caroline, you designed the whole thing, literally cover to cover. And so it is this nice art object that came out of it. So thank you. Yeah.